We're carrying on the theme of the morning, and our panel today is going to be talking about gender, race, and class, our faces of inequality changing. And we have a couple of great panelists, and I'd like to just first introduce them and then make a few comments. Sally Scholz is professor of philosophy and faculty in residence at the Center for Peace and Justice at Villanova University. She received her bachelor's at University of Portland in Portland, Oregon, and her master's and PhD in philosophy at Purdue. Her areas of specializations are social philosophy, political philosophy, ethics, feminist theory, Simone de Beauvoir, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. She has a long list of awards for teaching and research, and I'm not going to list them. But in addition to many published articles, she's also written books on feminism, A Beginner's Guide, Political Solidarity, and others. Our other panelist is Erika George, who is a professor of law here at the University of Utah's Quinney College of Law. She teaches constitutional law, international human rights law, international environmental law, and civil procedure. She earned her bachelor's with honors at the University of Chicago and her JD at Harvard Law School, where she also served as articles editor of the Harvard Civil Rights and Civil Liberties Law Review. She also has a master's in international relations at the University of Chicago. Her research explores the responsibilities of multinational corporations to respect international human rights and efforts to hold corporations accountable for rights violations. She has many other interests and has presented internationally, including to audiences in Europe, Africa, and South America. And our discussant is Michael Minch. He's an associate professor of philosophy and the director of Peace and Justice Studies at Utah Valley University. He studies political and moral theory, the relationship between theology, political theory, and peace building. So we have a great panel, and I am just going to start, as I was asked to do, by giving a little personal perspective. And in the interest of disclosure, I'll tell you right now, I'm a surgeon. As a surgeon, I almost never have a use for the word normative. In fact, the word normative plays so little role in what I do day to day that it's a little hard for me to wrap my mind around what normative is in a daily practical sense. I'm a pediatric urologist. We deal with very small things. In fact, very small genitalia on little babies. But I also take care of adults internationally. I also have run an NGO for the last 20 years, which works in more than 20 different countries in Asia, Africa, and Central and South America. And I am also the director of the Center for Global Surgery here at the University of Utah, where we attempt to consider some of these academic aspects of these problems. And we start to look at the interplay between theory and practice. We learn from you, we learn from the philosophers, the attorneys, the social scientists, and we try to bring some of our experience on a practical level to these very weighty questions about what do we do to help people. And in the helping of people, how do we also help the planet? So I will start just with an example. It's a little example, but it happens to be one I know well because I work also in Africa. So imagine that you are a woman. Even the guys can imagine this, I believe. because you had a mother. You might have sisters, you might have a wife. Imagine you're a woman somewhere north of Jos, Nigeria, and you happen to be a pregnant woman, perhaps you're 15 years old, and you go into labor. First time it's your first labor. You don't know too much about this, and so you call your mother, who may or may not have told you much about this either, and you go into traditional labor, which then goes on and on and on, and things may not be happening quite right. So your mother, if she's around, or your husband's mother, or whatever women are around, gather up the traditional healer who sits with you for a while, provides whatever services, traditional, which is mostly hot water, maybe a little tea. Things continue not to go well, and after a while it becomes clear that you are declining. You may be bleeding. You may be, indeed, after a day or two, on the verge of death. What do? You ask your husband if there's a doctor that he can take you to. Is there a guy in the community who has a motorcycle? Can they take you to the doctor? Well, if there's a doctor around, they'll take you to the doctor. You get to the hospital. Is the doctor available? Can you call ahead first? No, you don't have a cell phone. You get to the hospital. The doctor may or may not be there, but say it's 10 p.m. It's dark. There's no electricity. The doctor may or may not know how to do a cesarean section. That's what you need. That's not what you get. And by the time the whole thing resolves, you are either still alive, having lost the baby, you are not alive, leaving your husband without a wife, or you are alive with such a severe complication that it's going to impact everything else about your life. Cesarean section is something we take for granted in the United States. I was born by cesarean section. We take it for granted. And in America, and particularly in the wealthier parts of America, cesarean sections are done in more than 1/3 of pregnancies. Well, we've taken the thing to the other extreme. Okay, in Africa, most of Africa, you couldn't get one if you wanted one, unless you were in North Africa. In the States, you are as likely to get a cesarean section if you have any problems at all as you are to have a vaginal delivery. Does this matter? Well, it might. Between 2002 and 2009, C-sections increased by greater than 50%, from 27% of births to 34%. WHO recommends a cesarean section rate of probably about 5%, 5 to 10%. So if we're doing them in the States at a rate of 34%, is someone being harmed? Is the harm to women? Is the harm to children? You can argue on a medical basis that both of those things are true. So why do we do it? Do we do it for convenience? Do we do it because of doctor willingness? Do we do it because it pays more? Do we do it because the women don't know enough to know that there are better medical outcomes with a vaginal delivery? 44% of attempted vaginal deliveries in the United States end up in cesarean section. Well, why does any of this matter? It matters because women are, in most of the world, close to 50% of the population. These demographics are shifting in places where people have choice in terms of the gender of their children. But it also matters because there are politics involved. Who are the masters of the uterus? I heard that on NPR last weekend, and I thought it was just such a priceless idea. The masters of the uterus. Are these politicians? Are they doctors? Who's in charge here? Are they the women? And I would argue, really, they are not. Women don't have a voice, or they don't have a seat at the table. They are not the people arguing these problems. So, who is in charge of a woman's body? Is it the woman? Is it a community? Who's responsible? What's our duty to the woman or to the child? Is it the child first, the woman after? Is it the egg first, the woman after? Whose duty is what and to whom? I think these are important questions, and we can look at them on an individual basis. As practitioners, I'm a surgeon. It matters to me what my duty is to a patient. If a patient comes to me, my duty is to care for her or him. On the other hand, what is a politician's duty? And whose duty carries more weight? I think it's important to talk about these things both from the medical, the political, the sociological, and the philosophical point of view. And so I welcome our panelists who may not talk precisely about these problems, but it's in the context of feminism and gender and some other important things that they'll make their remarks.
So I am Sally Scholz, and I think for technical reasons we need to leave this up there, but I'll just ask you to well, anyway, it's there. In this brief presentation, I want to make and defend three simple but perhaps controversial claims or points. First, that feminist solidarities need human rights. Second, and perhaps a bit more difficult and interesting, is that human rights need feminist solidarities. Third, and this necessary relationship, or third, that this necessary relationship is both made possible by globalization and is a key to fighting some of the problems of globalization. Now, by feminist solidarities, I mean those coalitions and alliances among feminists, women's movements, and feminist groups, often reaching across borders, aimed at undermining sexist domination and improving the status of women. Feminist solidarities are formed as strategic connections in order to accomplish something that individually folks are unable to accomplish on their own. Participating groups enact a commitment to solidarity among diverse sets of actors. These are not identity-based or sisterhood models of solidarity, though they may grow out of such identity-based models, or more likely from the fracturing of them. The alliances and coalitions that form are issue-based with specific objectives. They are momentary and strategic. They may develop at times into longer-term relationships of support and mutual assistance, or even the more formal organization or agreement. But they need not be permanent alliances, and participating individuals and groups need not agree on all organizational and activist concerns. What brings them together is the recognition that collective effort on a particular issue or goal might yield mutually beneficial results. Feminist solidarities create relationships that determine the content of the moral obligations for participants. They are among the ever-expanding coalitions described as transnational, though they are distinct from mere transnational activists. These are networks which involve substantial work in information sharing so as to build an alliance or a relationship, and not just seek an activist response. Feminist solidarities generally have no official status in governments, and indeed at least some of the groups and individuals engaged in feminist solidarities. Sorry, there's a hole down here. Speakers have had to contend with. My heel just went into it. So at any rate, feminist solidarities generally have no official status in governments. Indeed, at least some of the governments and individuals engaged in feminist solidarities fit the traditional definition of social movements, insofar as they oppose the state. Feminist solidarities often bring together both formal civil society organizations and less formal support and resistance groups. They acknowledge and embrace the possibilities that emerge from seeing struggles against oppressive practices in different nations as connected. Further, they frequently utilize or rely on some of the communication tools of globalization. Now, it might be asked why the emphasis is on feminist solidarities and not just feminism, or even the more widely acceptable women or gender. The answer, I hope, is relatively simple. Feminist solidarities are critical, momentary, strategic movements. They embrace the political or politicized aspects of their causes and rely on the energy of social movements. Focusing merely on women or merely on gender is important, and I don't want to take away from that. But they don't have the same political import, or that focus doesn't have the same political import that feminist solidarities does. So although the term feminist solidarities is widely used, not all of those individuals or groups involved in feminist solidarities would accept the label feminist. Some would view feminism as too Western, too militant, too inattentive to culture, or just plain too encumbered with past baggage. Nevertheless, those writing about women's coalitional movements transnationally and globally and locally commonly use the term feminist solidarities, knowing that it may not be solely feminists united in solidarity. Just as we can act democratically without being a Democrat, we can act in feminist solidarity without necessarily being a feminist. We should also notice a distinction between women's movements and feminist movements, which might be united together in feminist solidarities. And this is a distinction that actually is very important to many of the activists who are working, especially in very traditional cultures that would reject messages coming from feminists. Women's movements converge around practical interests and aim at meeting immediate needs. Feminist movements respond to oppression and subordination, especially that which is embedded in social structures. Now, feminist solidarities include both women's movements and feminist movements, and many others. In other words, one of the many terrains that must be negotiated within feminist solidarities is the extent to which the alliance will make use of the language and methods of feminism. Clearly, there will be tensions and disagreements, but the goal of the coalition tends to override those barriers or obstacles to strategic partnership. Given that our focus is on feminist solidarities and human rights, it's also important to note that by feminist solidarities, I do not mean the so-called third generation of human rights or group-based rights. Feminist solidarities are not aimed at carving out another layer of human rights and do not seek special rights for their group. These are coalitions or alliances often acting on human rights principles or in response to violations. Now, before arguing that feminist solidarities need human rights, my first point, it's important to note that human rights have actually been quite soundly criticized from feminists and different feminist activists and theorists. One of the most troubling criticisms, and one that's become rather mainstream, is that human rights sometimes fail to include women in the category human. And that can be both cultural, of course, but it can also be a sort of blind spot in our application of human rights. Global feminists have worked for decades to change this, asserting that women's rights are human rights, and I'm sure you've probably heard that mantra at some point. It was, in fact, the central point coming out of the 4th UN Conference on Women in Beijing in 1995. The Platform for Action, or the Beijing Platform, that came out of that conference and set the agenda for women's equality globally, had to overcome the well-entrenched view that violations of women did not qualify as human rights violations because, well, they only happen to women. Traditional patriarchal cultures were not solely at fault in this. The international community had long held, for example, that rape of women during conflict situations was a regrettable but inevitable side effect of war. So a good example of how violations of women were not considered violations of human rights. Now, of course, there is a risk of focusing on women's human rights, that modified versions of human rights, and it risks obscuring some of the human rights violations that women suffer that are not gender-based. Similarly, such an approach might appear to make sexist domination the sole or primary form of oppression experienced by women. It also obscures the way that women are differently situated, experiencing oppression from a variety of different forces, including national political structures, ethno-masculinity, global racism, and material deprivation, to name just a few. A focus on women's human rights fails to account for the role that some women, or also fails to account for the role that some women play in the oppression of other women. So while human rights must include women, the aim is to widen the aperture by acknowledging the myriad violations of human rights that affect women, not solely the gendered ones. Additionally, two feminist criticisms of human rights principles and discourse focus on their place within the global community. On the one hand, many feminists argue that human rights are culturally based or rooted in the Western liberal tradition, and hence insufficiently attentive to cultural differences, or incapable of addressing non-liberal societies. This raises, and this, by the way, is also a criticism that comes from Islamic countries and no doubt many other cultures as well. This raises a particular challenge for attempts to use human rights in feminist solidarities or networks. On the other hand, third world feminism, and here the feminists have reappropriated the term third world to indicate the political power of reclaiming the name. Third world and post-colonial feminists argue that human rights discourse tends to be imperialistic or neo-colonial. By seemingly privileging Western values like equality, post-colonial and third world feminists highlight the imperialist agenda of development evident in human rights theory and practice. What, in other words, are the presumed wrongs that human rights aim to right? Are we engaged in fixing something or developing something that is already fixed and developed, just not to our imperialist specifications? Some third world and post-colonial feminists argue that human rights are yet another hegemonic discourse, in other words, built on the mistaken assumption that everyone is the same and they're moreover the same like us Northerners. Of course, this criticism assumes that human rights discourse originate from the global North, but there is evidence of the flow of influence coming, at least some of the flow of influence, coming from the global South. Women in Latin America, for instance, use their experience struggling against authoritarian rule to advocate effective human rights policy in the region and globally. Similarly, international women's conferences have enabled women's movements in the global South to influence international discourse and agenda and provided women's movements with recognition and support from states and international actors. Now, one of the most compelling and damning critiques of human rights from a feminist perspective is that rights only get at some of the harms suffered by women. Poor women struggling against domestic violence in South Africa, for instance, found much of their situation obscured or ignored in a rights-based approach. And we could add a similar phenomenon here in the United States. Their embeddedness in social relations, especially in impoverished areas, is central to their struggle, and yet a focus only on rights and autonomy ignores both socioeconomic challenges and the importance of social relations among women, indeed among all people. In spite of these very compelling criticisms, I argue that feminist solidarities need human rights. For most of us, this may not seem like such a bold claim, especially those of us here who have talked about human rights. Feminist solidarities have made ample use of the regional and international human rights documents and institutions. Nevertheless, to those third world and post-colonial feminists who reject human rights discourse as imperialistic, the claim that feminist solidarities needs human rights would be highly controversial. I hope to allay at least some of their concerns while agreeing that the tendency for imperialism looms ever present among many of the powerful states claiming a commitment to human rights, even when, or especially when, those states fail to sign on to some of the most important human rights agreements. And I have in mind there, just to get it concrete, the ICC, which the International Criminal Court, which the US didn't sign on to, and in not signing on to might be exerting a certain imperialist force. So I give 5 reasons for why feminist solidarities need human rights. First of all, human rights provide some of the language needed to raise issues in local contexts and to confront governments within nation states. Violence against women. The focus of the 4th conference in Beijing is perhaps the most immediately recognizable term, but equality and empowerment have become crucial terms that women's movements and feminist politics employed around the globe. Perhaps even more fundamentally, human rights provide feminist solidarities a resource for what's called communities of agreement. Feminists and women's activists do not all get along, and with good reason. Some feminists, because of their social class, race, imperial position, or political alignment, are a source of at least some oppression for other women. And we wouldn't expect any group of people to all have a monolithic view. Why would we expect feminists to also have this? So certain issues like abortion, sex work, and homosexual rights are also divisive, and certain aims like gender equality are not universally sought. A robust human rights agenda provides an epistemic base for alignments, even in spite of these disagreements. Feminist solidarities are able to find some common ground amid the variety of issues, some cause about which they can coalesce, even while they disagree on others. Third, human rights institutions and documents also provide feminist solidarities with regional and international mechanisms to challenge national policy. The most widely cited example of human rights mechanisms working in this way is the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. This convention describes discrimination against women and offers guidelines for how to overcome such discrimination at the national level. It also includes requirements for regular reporting as states seek to eliminate discrimination. Feminist solidarities have used both the document and the reporting requirements to push states to comply. Neera Tawhidi describes this and other UN documents on gender as a sort of blueprint and framework upon which women activists in Iran could argue for their issues and put pressure on state agencies. And in China, a leading women's activist uses the fact that the convention was signed by the Chinese government in entreating government officials to actually read it. Similar stories are cited throughout the literature on feminist solidarities. These alliances, formed at conferences via the internet and one-to-one interactions, enable national women's groups to achieve national objectives. 4, related to this, human rights principles and discourse provide a strategy to work with states. Local feminist movements gain momentum, support, and vocabulary from global human rights campaigns. In this way, feminist solidarities use human rights to overcome the divide between the movement and the state. By addressing particular issues from a human rights framework, feminist solidarities unite local movements with the organized international community and regional bodies, such as the European Union and the African Union. It is a global feminist movement, deeply rooted in women's movements around the world. One result is what some call gender mainstreaming, a concept introduced at the Nairobi conference in 1985 and incorporated into the Beijing agenda in 1995. Gender mainstreaming is a strategy aimed at integrating the gender perspective into every fiber of society. More specifically, it means incorporating gender equality perspective into all policies and at all policymaking levels. Numerous states have embraced gender mainstreaming, especially throughout Europe. Less so in the United States. Human rights principles. I've only gone for 15 minutes. So, I have 25 minutes, right? Human rights principles have clearly provided an avenue for feminist solidarities within nation states to work with their governments to enact gender-sensitive policies, as well as feminist solidarities within regions to work with regional bodies, to push for more consistent gender equality in legal, social, and economic spheres. One final reason for suggesting that feminist solidarities need human rights provide the impetus to join movements together. They work, for instance, with NGOs to fight poverty and AIDS, activists to combat ignorance surrounding HIV and AIDS in South Africa. And we can give many such examples. There are, of course, some downsides to relying on this, and I will skip those in an effort to get to my next point, which is that human rights need feminist solidarities. So this point is clearly more controversial of my main two points, and some human rights advocates would no doubt object that affiliating human rights with an overtly political and contentious, perhaps even divisive movement like feminism can only be a mistake. But of course, I'm not suggesting affiliating human rights with feminism. I'm arguing that human rights needs feminist solidarities. The difference is evident when one considers that feminist solidarities are strategic, momentary, and diverse. First of all, human rights needs feminist solidarities because feminist solidarities expand the applicability of human rights and lend strength to the discourse. The latter part of the 20th century saw numerous additions to the human rights documents and agenda as a result of the work of coalitions among women's movements and feminist movements. The UN conference in Beijing, as I've said, is a particularly productive case in point. The Platform for Action provides a careful accounting of violence against women as a human rights violation and challenges individual nations to examine and reform their systems. This illustrates feminist solidarity's role in expanding human rights discourse. The reverberations from the Beijing conference, and indeed the UN conferences, all the UN conferences on women, illustrate the effective role of feminist solidarities in strengthening human rights around the world. The public recognition and self-assurance that comes from individual and collective activism in feminist solidarities helps to build momentum for issues on the human rights agenda. The second reason the human rights discourse also needs feminist solidarity is because feminist solidarities create and sustain a feminist culture. Just as feminist solidarities rely on human rights culture to provide language to raise issues, regional and international mechanisms to challenge national policy, tools to criticize states, and an impetus to connect various movements, human rights institutions and discourse look to feminist solidarities to provide language to raise issues, regional and international mechanisms to challenge national policy, tools to criticize states, and the impetus to connect various movements. Feminist solidarities brought the concept of women's human rights, sexual harassment, domestic violence, violence against women, and forced pregnancy to the international community's conversations about human rights. Moreover, they continue to pressure international media outlets and human rights organizations to address such human rights issues as gender and poverty, human trafficking, and migrant domestic labor with such creatively politicized terms as feminization of poverty, sexploitation, and global care chains. This vocabulary is essential to the ability to address ever-expanding and ever more creative violations of human rights. The third reason human rights needs feminist solidarities is that feminist solidarities help force governmental compliance to United Nations declarations and conventions. Gains in the human rights arena are often hard-fought and once won precarious. Momentary alliances are necessary to help to defend social and political gains. Feminist solidarities lend force to the human rights instruments by joining diverse and at times otherwise opposed voices for the same cause. There's significant strength when we unite these oppositional forces. Think, for instance, when religiously affiliated women join with feminists to combat sex work, for instance. Finally, the fourth reason for suggesting that human rights need feminist solidarities is that they emphasize the continued importance of gendered analysis of human rights work itself. Campaigns include proper gender training for officials in international tribunals, increased efforts to prosecute violators of human rights, regardless of whether they're in one's own country or elsewhere, and a more thorough analysis of selective deference to culture. Engaged, committed feminist solidarities hold human rights institutions themselves accountable. And this was particularly evident in the, after the Yugoslav war, when the UN peacekeepers were there. They participated in prostitution and rape. And so the feminist solidarities that emerged forced the UN to recognize this problem and to create standard mechanisms to prevent similar things from happening again. Now, my last point, that this necessary relationship between feminist solidarities and human rights is essential in the wake of globalization. I'll just say a few quick words here. Globalization brings with it new forms of oppression, like the privileging of corporate rights over the rights of humans, or the hegemony of American consumerist culture. It exacerbates old forms of oppression, like human trafficking, which brings with it the commodification of the body, a phenomenon traditionally not seen in many cultures. It also transforms certain forms of oppression into more intractable forms, like sex work and domestic work that become part of the global trade. But economic globalization has also provide a renewed impetus for feminist solidarities with the tools, the ease of communication and the flow of information facilitated by transnational and global alliances. Consider, for instance, the networking that's possible when supply-side feminists and women's groups join together in solidarity with demand-side feminists and women's groups to combat human trafficking. Women's groups in Thailand joined feminist groups in Norway in feminist solidarity over this issue and brought significant social and political and legal change. Another example, that is a book that many of you have probably read, Nicholas Kristof and Cheryl Wu Dunn's Half the Sky, which is, I think, a nice example of an international media lending support to certain causes, raising awareness and framing information, providing the possibility for greater alliances. There is, however, also a downside to this ease of communication. The quality of the information and the motive or bias in its presentation ought to be put into question. Often the issues facing some women are sensationalized or exoticized. Issues are at times presented in a way that creates distance between the women experiencing them and the men and women reading or hearing about them. And here, Kristof and Wu Dunn might actually be an example of this. For instance, they seem to separate the plight of women over there from the suffering that women experience here. And indeed, there's very little acknowledgement of suffering here. Take, for instance, the example of domestic violence and honor killing. Why is there an intense focus on 15 women who die every year in Jordan as a result of honor killings, when more than 3,000 women in the United States, about 1/3 of all women murdered, also die of domestic violence? Now, I'm not suggesting that we ought to ignore the honor killing. I'm saying that we ought to build solidarities that connect them so that we have strength in the power of fighting our struggles. Additionally, without fostering the relationships of solidarity, transnational activists run some risks of jumping in too quickly and failing to see the appropriate local circumstances. An example pulled from the literature is of a Nigerian woman who was convicted of adultery. Transnational activists, not in solidarity, but, well, I suppose in solidarity, but not without the requisite connections and alliances and information, wrote to support her, but the animosity it stirred up actually caused her to be treated much worse by the Nigerian authorities. So solidarities are crucial for avoiding these pitfalls. Feminist solidarities build alliances in order to include diverse voices and determine appropriate methods for response. The interaction between feminist solidarities and human rights, both lending a critical eye, helps in the scrutiny of information framing. Local biases and ideological blinders may keep us from recognizing some things as oppressive or as human rights violations, and global movements may cause us to rush to activism without proper attention to facts and local concerns. Feminist solidarities using the language and culture of human rights build politically informed bridges between issues, cultures, and help to bring certain things to light for our collective response. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the organizers of the conference, my colleagues here at the University of Utah, for putting on what has been a tremendously interesting, provocative, and important series of conversations. So I'm very privileged to feel that I'll be able to contribute to that. So we've been tasked today to talk in a conference on economic globalization, crisis, and the common good about the changing face of inequality. I'm interested primarily in actors beyond the state, and my remarks will actually address the kinds of questions around duty that were raised earlier and also involve solidarity. So I hope to integrate some of the things that we've been learning into this talk. So my title is Change. I'm interested in how change is created and generated in ways that could generate greater gender equality. And globalization is really a process, of economic globalization for the purposes of this conference. I'm interested in what occurs when technology meets tradition, what occurs when the marketplace meets women where they reside. So I'll give you my remarks in three parts. I'll first talk about gender and globalization and examine where women are in the global economy. I'll then present two case studies that attempt to illustrate the ways in which private actors, principally multinational corporations involved in foreign direct investment or product distribution in two countries in particular, have generated change for good or ill. And then finally, I want to explore what the responsibilities of those industry actors would be. So we began with questioning who were the masters of the uterus, if corporate capital is the master of what is modern globalization, what is their role in creating gender equality or not. All right. So globalization and gender roles. Globalization, narrowly defined in terms of economic globalization for the purposes of this conference, in the World Bank view, is simply a reference to the increasing integration of domestic economies. The World Trade Organization speaks of accelerated transfer of capital. A more expansive view, the kinds of things you see in documents like the World Health Organization talk about globalization of norms as well. So for example, norms of feminist solidarity or human rights. I'm going to take a broad view of globalizations for the purposes of this talk and kind of question detractors of globalization, people who critique it, and those who celebrate it. There are various critiques. Globalization and its discontents. Looking at any bookshelf on globalization, you will see a range of titles that work to really challenge and question what globalization is doing and for whom. Routinely, there are protests of the WTO, and the concern is that globalization is actually exacerbating existing oppression and inequality. Another view, and this would be celebrating globalization. Celebrating globalization speaks to the opportunities that are created for some of the more vulnerable members of society. For example, you can imagine a woman totally disconnected from markets having access to income, and we know that elevating women's access to income often results in positive outcomes for her and her family. So whatever view that you take of globalization, feminist economists have pointed to this observation about where women reside in the global economy. So virtually universally, the script of gender roles has historically been that in the private sphere is where women's work occurs. You're in the reproductive realm of existence, and that's often not compensated in a monetary way. What globalization permits is entering into the productive market economy. One of the significant features of this modern wave of globalization is the horizontal nature of production. So my clicker thing here that's not working terribly well, the component parts could have been made in Asia. The raw materials making it probably came from parts of Africa, and it's distributed globally. So if we horizontalize our manufacturing process, increasingly women are a part of that chain. So if this structural and ideological division between what is valued and what is valuable is translated into the market economy, we end up with a circumstance where women's work is worth less. If the evaluation of the kinds of work women do is worth less, it's actually attractive because it's less expensive. If you are a corporation looking to source your products, you'd want low-wage labor, and women are lower-wage labor. A lot of the economic growth in Asia has been attributed to its export processing from manufactured goods. The workforce in that realm is predominantly women. So that raises important questions about whether discrimination is replicated in these workplaces, and evidence suggests that it is. At the same time, women are engaging in economic activity that's giving them access to income, and that's changing and shaping gender roles. So in ways, the kind of replication of a retrograde gender role that sees women as worth less has given them access to opportunities that's bringing them income, and we can question whether that's translating into understanding them as being worth more. But in significant measure, women are contributing to what is driving the global economy to the extent that it's global production, and I'm going to limit, at least for the purposes of this talk, that to manufactured goods. Women are found in textile, in commercial consumer electronics. In many of the things that you own, a woman was likely involved somewhere along the supply chain. But this talk isn't about human rights abuses along supply chains. It's actually about two interesting examples that I'd like to share about corporate actors who've gone into middle-income countries and had different impacts on the conditions of gender equality. All right. My first example is General Electric. General Electric manufactures many important products that are extraordinarily valuable. One of their more valuable products that's contributed to saving lives around the world has been portable ultrasound. Portable ultrasound machines can range in size from the size of a cell phone to the size of a laptop. Villages in India, cities in India have been able to save lives. You can look at the condition of someone's heart. You can also look at a fetus. In the areas where General Electric has introduced portable electronic ultrasound machines, there's been a statistically significant sharp drop-off in the number of females born. Now, General Electric is simply doing what General Electric does, which is bringing innovative products to market, advancing technology, and bringing that into communities that arguably need it. The problem becomes that they are bringing new technology and bumping up against a traditional culture that has valued conventionally women less. So I'd like to talk a little bit about what I will call the economics of gendercide. In economic terms, one of the practitioners who uses this technology reportedly in a women's rights magazine had a sign, "Pay now, save later." It makes economic sense in a way. While dowry has been outlawed on the books in India for quite a long while, in cultural practice and tradition, it still is often paid. So if you are the parent of a girl child, ultimately down the road, this girl child will cost you much. She will leave your family, will pay at her wedding. She's less likely to carry on the family name, to provide for you in your old age. Arguably, on just economic grounds, conceivably, an argument can be made that it may be in the best interest of the family to have a male child. This seems to be what has been occurring, and not without and over the objections of women rights activists in India. This particular example came to my attention after General Electric was sued by public prosecutors in one of the states in India. It is unclear what their obligations would be under the law. There is great law in India. Much of India's law is fantastic law. The role of law is having a prenatal diagnostic act that prevents the misuse of these technologies. And yet the technology persists and continues to be misused. So what is the role of the responsibility of General Electric in this? Well, General Electric executives in India were quoted as saying, you know, this is like a car. There are car accidents all the time. Am I responsible for how this product is used or misused? And that remains an interesting, important, and open question that women activists in India are trying to close ground on. So there's a role of law, but it's unclear that that's going to be something that can trump traditional biases. But it would seem to be the case, you'd imagine, that if women can become more valuable, worth more rather than less, we'd see a change. So that's case study one, talking about how this particular international corporate actor has brought about change, but not change that we'd celebrate as being one that would engender greater gender equality. The second is Facebook. Is anyone here familiar with Facebook? Using Facebook? Using Facebook as I speak? Okay, Facebook users. Actually, that's not too many, and there might be principled reasons why. If you were arguably a woman in the North Africa, Middle East region, you'd been about a third less likely to have raised your hand. So this technology has reached North Africa, the Middle East. I'm talking about this because I've actually been doing work more recently on the Arab Spring and the role of gender there. But you see, most of the world has about a 50-50 gender split on Facebook usage. In the Arab region, Facebook has less than a third of those, this is the red, I'm not quite sure what color that's looking like to you, are users that are female, the blue are male. So you see roughly, with the exception of Lebanon and some others, we're looking at about a third Facebook usage among women. Another distinctive feature about this region is the age of users. The North Africa, Middle East region is having a youth bulge. In any given country that was on that slide, running from Lebanon to Somalia, about 55 to 70% of the population is under 30. These are new technology users. How are they using it around the Arab region? They're using it to communicate, they're using it for entertainment, they're using it for sharing information with one another. And men and women are using this new media technology in roughly the same way. Taken together, how Facebook was used in the Arab Spring, at least in the instance of Egypt, is with promoting social change. Facebook, there are babies in Egypt being named Facebook now, apparently. But this is the Facebook page of a former, maybe still current Google executive who posted this page in commemoration of the life of Khalid Said. This was a young man who was killed after being tortured by police. And this page was meant to commemorate a particular life, but instead it became a community around which other people in Egypt disclosed their stories about encounters with police and police abuse. So it built a solidarity community that was ready and able for the Day of Rage on January 25th to take their community out of cyberspace and onto the streets. So the use of social media, these are graphs that I took from a report done by the School of Government in Dubai. They've been surveying youth Middle Eastern users of internet communications technology for the last couple of years, and a segment of that school does work on gender, the kind of work that I'm interested in. Here you'll see that the ways in which social media was used changed over the course of that uprising period, from simply entertainment to actually explaining internally why we are revolting, and also to anticipate an external audience about the causes of why it is we're engaged in revolution. So, since we've seen a successful example of this particular new technology entering a market and making change, I'm interested in the way that women can use social media to increase their political and economic participation. If we are going to have economic justice and gender equality in a global economy, central to that will be women's political participation in the countries of their origin and their economic participation broadly. So, the story is mixed. Women in the Arab region are using social media less than men. You've seen that just in the Facebook example. And research polling shows that most of the reason for this disparate usage is cultural constraints and beliefs about women's role. That's combined with very optimistic promises about how women's role could be empowered by social media. This is men and women in gender parity pretty much agreeing that new technology is going to be the basis for a new movement for women. In fact, this last column speaks to political empowerment, and more men than women think that new technology is going to promote that kind of social change. So on the topic of change, social change, and how women are changing the way social media and new technology are used, I want to talk about two interesting initiatives originating in this region run by women. This is an example of solidarity. What this is HarassMap. HarassMap is a website out of Cairo, and it allows women to use their cell phones to send SMS text messages when they encounter an incident of sexual harassment. According to some surveys, over 80% of Egyptian women will at some point in their life encounter sexual harassment. This big red zone with 230 or that number of texts coming from that center region of the city where women were maybe groped on the street or catcalled or something. And other women share this information, and together they're kind of collectively creating a story about their life experience, which ultimately maybe someday a policymaker will have to address, or others in their community. The other example that I love is a Facebook page and a Twitter feed run by Women to Drive. These are women in Saudi Arabia. They use the technology to coordinate joyrides. So women in Saudi Arabia, if you aren't aware, aren't permitted to drive, at least legally. So they're coordinating acts of civil disobedience to challenge an unjust law that otherwise would limit greatly their mobility. They're taking their space and cyberspace community, making claims, and then bringing social action into the streets, literally. So change. How is it? This is my example of positive change of a commercial actor and using a technology in a way to promote gender empowerment. It's my position that if women in the world are ever going to achieve greater equality, there are three things that have to occur. One, their participation needs to increase. The perception of women needs to change. Participation in the economic realm, in the political realm, and ultimately that'll translate into the kind of power that is consistent with what international human rights law envisions. So my colleague has already spoke to you about CEDAW. This is the Convention on All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. CEDAW would require state actors, right, the states that sign on to these treaties, to ensure that women can participate in political life. Right? So there's been political transition in the Middle East region. Libya now has a National Transitional Council. How many women, this is an open question, not rhetorical, are on Libya's National Transitional Council, might you imagine? Oh, any others? I'm happy to say you're wrong. There's actually one woman of the 51-member National Transition Council in Libya. Egypt. Egypt has a constitutional drafting committee. How many women are on the Constitutional Drafting Committee? This is going to be the committee that will talk about political participation. I get to write a constitution that is going to lay out what my political regime will look like for the future. Are women in part of that future? Absolutely no women will be part of that future. All right. Okay, so this seems to be a sharp variance with what CEDAW would require of state parties. What about political participation? Well, this is Dalia Zaidia. She is an Egyptian blogger. She is using new communications technology. She was instrumental in forming one of the new political parties. She ran for office unsuccessfully. Largely the Muslim Brotherhood has come to majority in Egypt's new system, and I'm happy to talk about that in Q&A. But nonetheless, she has been a persistent voice of dissent, even under the Mubarak regime, and she's able to do a lot of her work from her laptop. And that's absolutely brilliant, and I think that she will, along with other women, ultimately force greater political participation for Egyptian women. Perception. The other key thing for women is perception, both how they perceive themselves and how they're perceived by others. And if you watched coverage of the Arab Spring, there were multiple narratives going on, right? There's the Saudi woman draped in black who can't drive. There's the sexual harassment happening in Tahrir Square. Well, there were also stories of solidarity between men and women engaged in claiming more space for political participation. But what the images coming out of Tahrir Square showed, aside from the sexual harassment, and I'll continue to talk about that, was women participating. So CEDAW also requires, in addition to changing laws to increase political participation, is a notion that what has to also change is social customs and norms and tradition, right? You have to modify the kinds of cultural patterns that keep women out of the economic sphere and out of the political sphere. Arguably, corporate actors and new technology have some role in shaping this kind of change. And that's what has happened in the kinds of initiatives that women are engaged in social media. This is another Egyptian. She's Egyptian American, and she was the journalist who was with CNN, who you may have seen images of being attacked in the square. Right. She later said this, people are like, well, aren't you embarrassed? People now know you were assaulted. And, she says, the most important thing I can do is share the reality of what my experience is. When you speak about what your experience is, you begin to change and shape perception. And you act as if you matter. And that brings me to power. So if women are able to use new technologies for empowerment and changing the perception of them, then they reach actual equality. And under CEDAW, equality is really understood as inclusion more than anything else. What CEDAW is attempting to eradicate is exclusion and restriction on the basis of sex, and ensure that women are enjoying, on equal terms with men, full human rights, as women are also human. So maybe power would look like this. This is the vision of a Yemeni blogger who's also part of this community of North African, Middle East activists. And I love that. So, what about corporate social responsibility? All I've been able to talk to you about in terms of law is what a government requires or what the international law requires of Egypt or of India. We know from classical corporate law and theory that a corporation's obligations, at minimum, are simply to make profits within the boundary of the law. Women are existing under laws that are largely repressive in wide swaths of the world. So is it sufficient if you're GE operating in India to simply make profits? You are indeed making profits. You hold 50% of the market, which in 2007 was over $100 million. So you've been very successful at that. You've met your responsibility under a Milton Friedman standard of what corporate social responsibility would be. Facebook is having or has already had its IPO, much money will be made. So these are very responsible corporations by the standard of corporate social responsibility that is pointed to shareholder primacy. Shareholders in both of these corporations would do quite well. If you're a woman, how do you do? And if you're a corporation, might you ask what your opportunities are for engendering greater gender equality? And the ways in which that might even be good for your bottom line. More Facebook users that are female, more people to market to, more people in the market. So I don't have answers to these, but I wanted to close with two questions. If you are a global corporate actor, what is the changing responsibility of business? What responsibility, if any, do you have when you know you're entering into an area where there are existing and deep inequalities based on gender? Might you do something to actively elevate the status of women? And then finally, how can globalization, economic globalization, bring the conduct of corporate actors into greater alignment with international human rights law? There's a part of me that thinks that these might not be inconsistent with a more expansive understanding of what the social responsibility, what the social role of corporations is in the global system. We do know that they are driving economic globalization. We do know that law often doesn't keep up with them. And we do know that law departs from culture. We can have laws like CEDAW that aim to protect women, but ultimately there's a culture around how women exist in the world that is an impediment. Can corporations be the avenue that ultimately promotes greater change? So the non-state actor, to my mind, is the pressing, interesting problem in question with respect to economic globalization. It is largely unregulated in the realm of the social. This is not intellectual property, international trade. Facebook is not a signatory to CEDAW or any other international convention, nor could it be. But could it do something to improve human rights, promote social change? We've seen social media do that, at least. We've seen GE and ultrasounds do that. So we know there's change. The question is what direction that change will take. And I argue that it should be one that helps to elevate the status of women, and I believe it's imminently possible for that to occur.
I can answer any questions.
Well, questions
I'll
can
try
be
to answer
answered by the panel.
Well, I take it that my job here is to be a respondent, and as you can see, I'm a man. And so I think that I could be a bit intimidated or threatened or fearful on a panel discussing feminism and such. because men, of course, have a long history of speaking about women as though they know what they're saying. I don't know if I should feel any of those things, but I do feel honored. So thank you for letting me be here and respond. And both of you have put me in a very difficult situation because I found so very, very little in what you both said with which I disagree, which is the easiest thing to do, is disagree with you. And so what I've decided I'm going to do is simply ask some questions that you've both raised for me. And first in response to Professor Scholz, and then in response to Professor George. And these are honest questions for me. They're not coy attempts to say something contrary to what you've said, but I take them to be honest questions. And by the way, I think this is a very strong sign of a good intellectual presentation, that it raises good questions. And so I hope my questions are somewhat as good as your statements have been. So the first question I have is this. Sally, you said that feminist solidarities are created out of relationships which determine moral responsibilities. That is to say, again, that our relationships determine our responsibilities. And in fact, in your abstract, you put it this way: instead of looking for a philosophical grounding of human rights, transnational, global, third world, and post-colonial feminists employ a critical strategy, transforming human rights and human rights discourse into an organic process in response to ever-changing violations. And I do like the reference to organicism and critical strategies, but I yet still wonder if it's really possible to have human rights discourse and conceptions of human rights entirely absent of philosophical foundations. So that's my first question. The second one is that if feminist and womanist assemblages and coalitions and movements are really, really seriously engaged in human rights work, can they remain inclusive? Can they really only be for women and about women, among women, when they are so or appear to be so? My third question is, do feminist and womanist assemblages and coalitions and movements need, in some sense, to utilize the capabilities approach pioneered by Martha Nussbaum and Amartya Sen, and now elaborated by many others, over human rights? That is, is what the human rights, is what the capabilities approach offers us really more consonant with feminist and womanists' needs and concerns and construals, etc.? And alternatively, are the capabilities approach and the human rights approach, or approaches in each camp, really separable in any case? So I'm asking that last question about myself too. Another question, Sally, that your very fine presentation gave rise to for me is, in respect to your claim that human rights needs feminist solidarities, you said feminist solidarities create feminist culture. Certainly, that's true and important. I think also that feminist culture creates feminist solidarities. And you didn't speak to that, and of course you only have so much time. But I wonder if that needs to be addressed, and what the differences are, and how they play out. And then, before I turn to a response to Erika, listening to you made me think of something, and this isn't so much a question, but a thought, and then I'd be happy to hear your response. You know, among human beings, all of us, all 7 billion of us, we have our similarities and we have our differences. I happen to think that our similarities are most important, but our differences are most interesting. And in the relationships and engagement with others, with one another, it's, I think, always important to keep in mind there are similarities here and there are differences here, and I happen to think it's always also important to keep in mind the similarities are most important. In any case, I wonder if this space or this nexus or relationship between feminism and human rights that you're working in creates a really, really nice place for us to consider well, to consider deeply both our similarities and our differences, because whereas I think feminism on balance sort of leans toward concern about difference, I think human rights on balance leans toward concern about similarity. That's just a thought. Now I would like to respond briefly to your remarks, Dr. George, which I also found really wonderful. Thank you. You said that women's work drives the global economy. That was the quote on your PowerPoint. And you said there's a considerable extent to which the global economy is driven by women's work, which got me thinking, it would be really, really great to have a lot of quantitative data about that. And maybe you have it, or maybe a lot of people do. For this reason, it seems to me, just to the degree that that's true, and we know the ways that it's true and the details of its truthfulness, then very wonderfully, it seems then we would have a lever of women's empowerment. Right? Taking into account all the relevant details. Because just to the degree that women drive the global economy, there is a place where women have some power to make demands, to drive changes, etc. In all the details that I don't know, but I hope other people do. This question occurs to me as well. You asked the question, and I think we're in part answering it. When you raise the issue of whether social media and other technologies empower women, and then you gave two wonderful examples of that. And this is a question about whether we need a caution. And the caution would be, let us not be overly optimistic. Let us not overdetermine the ways that technologies of different kinds may empower women, because at bottom and in the end, the kinds of oppressions and dominations and injustices that women suffer, and suffer uniquely or suffer disproportionately, are wrought by a deficit of moral seriousness that is institutionalized in various assemblages and political associations and cultural and religious forms. That's where the problem is generated. And so perhaps we would need to be careful not to be over-reliant on technology to solve our moral problems. Maybe we need to have moral ways to solve our moral problems in a deeper sense than technology might allow or that it might obscure. And now what I want to do is not ask a question but answer one, and then I'll sit down. So you asked a question, which was, do corporations have a moral responsibility when they are engaged in a context where there are very serious inequalities to engage the communities there to do what they can do to ameliorate those inequalities? And I didn't know this was going to be a part of your presentation, or I might have said to you when you read my bio that I used to work with the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility in New York City, and I've done some work in this. And I just have an answer, and the answer is yes. And I very much appreciate what you both had to say, and so I'll take my seat. Thank you.
So I think our panelists will answer these questions and then take questions from the floor before lunch.
So thank you so much for those questions. This is okay, and I won't try to answer them all because I'd like to hear what other what insights everyone has to offer. But let me see if I can blend maybe three of them into one quick answer. And you asked about whether we need the philosophical foundations and can feminists engaged in human rights work remain inclusive, right? And you know, one way to answer this is to actually look at the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which some might argue, I might argue, although I'm not prepared to do that right now, itself lacks philosophical foundations. In fact, it was exactly the sort of dynamic instrument that resulted from, you know, different peoples, different cultures coming together and you know, putting down on the table what they need. And also looking at that document, there's a sense in which you see the tension between the human rights approach and what might be called a capabilities approach, and I'm referring here to the legal and civil rights in the early part of the document and the social and economic rights in the latter part of the document. You get a sense of the political tensions that resulted in this document itself, and you see a sort of tension between rights that generally we want to be philosophically founded on something like autonomy or personhood or some such thing, and needs, which are grounded in, well, what we need, right? What is it that we need to flourish? So there's a sense in which one might argue, and I guess I'm trying to do that, that document itself is a sort of dynamic outgrowth, right? And that's in effect what I'm saying is happening with feminist solidarities too, that they are contributing to a growing body of human rights things in important ways. So, and I think it has to be inclusive. And I'm going to go back and scrutinize my paper and see where I suggested it was exclusive, because I think that's wrong.
I don't. Can I respond? I didn't hear you suggesting it was exclusive.
Okay.
So much as I was simply raising a question that was provoked by your paper.
Great.
Because it was all about feminist coalitions and so on, and so it simply got me thinking about, since you're interested in the relationship between feminist coalitions and human rights, because as we all know, many feminist theorists and activists and coalitions aren't very concerned at all about they're very exclusive.
Yeah.
They're not at all worried about inclusivity. So I was thinking about a broader phenomenon and so not simply about what you said.
You want me to solve all the problems of feminism, right?
I want
yeah.
Can I also respond very quickly to it is obviously true that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights doesn't reference or use philosophical foundations, but that doesn't mean they're not presupposed. So you're obviously not going to write about Kant or something and hope that, you know, non-Western peoples are going to, they're not going to embrace Kant and all that, and that all makes sense. But it might be that the General Assembly adopted and promulgated the Universal Declaration thinking that people from all over the world in various cultures from various life experiences will have their own reasons, indeed their own philosophical foundations, to embrace these claims about our rights. So I'm not willing to simply conclude that because philosophical foundational language is not in the document, that it means that you can have rights without such foundations. So I think a more sophisticated kind of argument would have to be enjoined. And I'm not sure what the answer is. Right. It's a genuine question, but okay.
Should I? Okay, gosh, maybe I took a little just kind of rhetorical liberal approach to women driving the global economy. So let me explain that a bit more. Women really reside at the bottom of the global supply chain. So they're there, but they're there as labor. And parallel to women's entering the marketplace as labor, we've seen a decline in the political power of labor. So it's a bit of a mixed story. But to the extent that I am a consumer in, high late capitalism, a lot of what I buy is made by women. So maybe there is some space there and power to make change, but they tend to reside in the lower paid portions of that kind of work. So for example, even in service work that's higher in India, where there's a lot of outsourcing of the call centers, men work in bill collection that gets paid more than women who work in customer service, because there's kind of this gendered notion of, oh, women are comforting and they can answer your questions. So there's a wage gap still along that. But the positive part of the story is women are increasingly in possession of their own resources and changing gender roles. So if I have a job in a call center, I have my own money and maybe I can make more decisions on the margins. There is some power to make change, but your questions made me think that perhaps I'd overstated it. There are multiple drivers of the global economy, but women are a significant part of it, and a surprising percentage of the labor in export processing zones is female labor. The second point, the power of social media to empower women. Yeah, you spoke about, sure, we have these technologies, but the culture is there. I think these technologies can change culture. So the India example is maybe not changing the culture, but the culture taking it and using the technology in ways that didn't help to empower women. I think that, sure, this is a moral problem, and it's not to technology to answer the moral problem, but it can help shape the context in which we have the conversation and expand that conversation around culture and morals. And I also believe culture is something that's fluid, and it's changing in response to the introduction of these newer things. So I guess it's a bit of a dialectic, how these forces will flow and influence one another. But to the extent that you have the opportunity to influence things in a way that's going to enlarge somebody's opportunities for freedom and equality, I agree with you, yes, that should be done. But to what extent is there a moral foundation to attach that obligation to a party that hasn't assumed it, that generally tends to take a narrow space understanding of their sphere of influence, the corporate actor, as opposed to the state, which is the one that's legally bound to promote, protect, and respect human rights. So I guess where I'm interested in taking this is, to the extent women are empowered to be able to challenge and question their culture, they also should challenge and question corporate actors as well. I think we all should be doing that. But there is change, and the question is whether it'll be positive or negative net for me.
Shall we take some questions from the floor? Yes. Yes, there's a microphone right behind you.
Hi, I'm Günseli Berik from Economics Department, and I'm fascinated by both presentations, and I want to pick up on Michael Mink's point about the capabilities approach. While you laid out a comprehensive sort of argument as to why human rights approach needs feminist solidarities and vice versa, I actually am more persuaded by the capabilities approach as being more appropriate for the task. And Martha Nussbaum makes a very eloquent and sort of detailed argument as to why human rights approach is deficient in many ways in promoting and guiding the promotion of well-being globally, and women, with women in particular in mind. And so I would actually like to hear your response or your thoughts on that argument as to why not the capabilities approach? Why do we have to subscribe to the human rights approach? And on the question of, and I guess I want to jump in on Erika's answer to your question, to the question about how is it that women are drivers, or rather, what should we do about this women's role as driver in the global economy? And there are many studies that actually show that countries gain comparative advantage in the global market, in the export market, to the extent that the gender wage gap is wider in those economies. And these are case studies, cross-country studies. And so it doesn't, I mean, it's something we have to play up and point out, but I don't know that it's necessarily a positive picture, because it says to the extent that they are more exploited, they are more a driver of the economy, global economy. So it's something for us to think about strategically, I guess.
Sure. Thank you. Yes, actually, it was resources that people in your department and yourself gave me that got me on to thinking about women and their place in the global supply chain and the marketplace. Yes, but actually, human rights helps that. I didn't use this talk to talk about labor rights along the supply chain, but to the extent that you have freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, ability to organize, perhaps that's where you can start talking about power. And we've had the recent example of Apple's troubles in the news, in the media. One of the previous panelists asked, why does it take CNN to put something on an agenda? It does take CNN to put something on an agenda, or social media, or Facebook, or whatever it is. I'm happy something's on the agenda. And to the extent more women are talking about their experiences as if they matter, whether it's in the workplace, whether it's in Tahrir Square, I think we can start to build solidarities among feminists, among human rights activists. I actually have questions for you too, if I could. On the capabilities point, I also do a lot of writing and thinking about capabilities. I view it as something that supports rights. I think it is much more rich descriptively about what is required to achieve well-being. I just am not persuaded that politically it is feasible to approach anything that would be justiciable or policy-making, speaking of capabilities, rather than in terms of rights that are in law. Okay, and I'm the lawyer and on the mail, so that could be my bias, but I think there's a political power to rights, and I view capabilities as something that kind of enriches our discourse around rights, and it helps me understand, say, what a socioeconomic right might look like. So I think it's really important and valuable work that Amartya Sen and Nussbaum are doing that complements rather than takes away from rights. So I disagree, I think, with Nussbaum and saying capabilities is better than rights. I think that they really could do some powerful work together as mutually reinforcing things. My question for you also, since you're going next, was around, well, third world perspectives of feminism and human rights. And your point that human rights, you seem to suggest that there was some distance between human rights and feminism or women's rights. And I guess I wanted to push you further on that. I think I heard you say that human rights needs feminist solidarities, and that there was this initial or perhaps persistent reluctance on the part of the human rights movement to recognize and appreciate that. I don't know. I don't think part of human rights movement, or that human rights needs feminist solidarities. And I wondered if you would go further. Because you seem to suggest that there was a part of human rights that feared the politics of feminism. And I think it's precisely the politics of feminism that gives the human rights traction, because there are such models of powerful solidarity there. So I don't know if that's what you intended.
No, I actually do agree with that there is that traction, but I think that there's also a significant vein in human rights discourse in the institutions, to depoliticize and to distance from feminism itself, and actually there's an
I think they'd be wrong then.
Oh, well, you know, I'd agree with that too, and that's why I chose feminist solidarities and not just gender, as I said early on, or not just women, because and a number of folks have given this, so this is not an original thought, but a number of folks have given this notion that gender mainstreaming, for instance, it does depoliticize and takes away some of the mobilization of feminist movements, and that it can be actually disempowering for women rather than empowering. So there's a tension, and I think that's what I'm trying to get at.
I guess it struck me as sort of the pot calling the kettle black. Like for human rights movement to say that this is too political, I mean, at its heart, human rights is political if you're going to assert the claim about it seriously. So.
Sure. Well, and you know, I'm drawing together varieties of different literatures. So certainly there's the pot calling the kettle black and the kettle calling the black, or the pot black, whatever it is. But in a way, I just use that to sort of set up why this is important. And ultimately, I think it's kind of a no-brainer argument. Of course, human rights needs feminist solidarities, and of course, the other way, right? But yet you have these criticisms. One of my worries is about academic feminists who, and there's a significant body of academic feminists who have, you know, gotten tenure, whatever, on criticizing universal principles, on criticizing human rights, and that's dangerous in this world, right? And so the strategic element here, or part of the strategic element, is to say, look, we can criticize the theoretical, but we need to be careful because these still have a role to play in this world, right? And that's very important. And in a way, that speaks to the capabilities too. I don't mean to. I agree with Erika. I don't mean to say that it's not capabilities or not that wouldn't be a useful approach. And I like Martha Nussbaum's global social justice approach. I don't think it's as distinct, and that is, I don't think capabilities and human rights are that distinct. And I approach that in the larger paper by talking about human rights as a discourse, rather than solely as universal principles. And so I think that kind of gets at your question, which is a very good one. So
can I just
think we have time for one more, I believe. Polly?
Yeah, I think the gender distinction of men and women, and is very useful for human rights, for feminist movements. But when you want to bring about change on the ground, you have to realize that women are not sort of considered category women in the societies. They're wives, they're mothers, they're daughters, they're grandmothers. And when you want to change men, you have to play on the kinship. So the husband may be wanting to keep the wife at home. But then you say to the brother, yes, but if she gets an education and earns money, think of what networks this will set up for you. And he starts to pressure the husband. And then you go and say to the father, when you're old, if this daughter is educated and she can go out and do this, she can support you. And then there may be the son. So I think you really need to think of women not as a category, but as the many roles that they play. And when you try to change men, you try to pitch it to the different categories. Some are much easier than the other. The husband is always the most difficult.
I think that's a brilliant observation. And I think we ought to break for lunch and then speak more about this while we're eating.